Hello, and warm welcome to everyone to the African Climate Foundation Strategic Framework Launch and Advisory Council Dialogue on Pan-African Perspectives on Energy Transition Trajectories in Africa. My name is Nkateko Chauke, Senior Project Manager at the African Climate Foundation. I'm delighted to be hosting you for this virtual event from Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you to all of you for joining us from across the world. Our hashtags for today to enable you to engage with us on social media, to share your thoughts and ideas is hashtag African Climate Solutions. The African Climate Foundation is launching its strategic framework after celebrating its 1-year anniversary since it was founded in April 2020. The launch of this strategic framework comes at a critical time as we celebrate Africa Day today, as well as gear up to the COP26 in November this year. The world is approaching a very, very decisive moment for efforts to tackle the climate crisis. And Africa is the most vulnerable and affected region to climate change impacts. This means that as African countries embark on a clean energy transition trajectory, renewables need to be integrated with a broad-based economic transformation agenda that prioritizes sustainable development and prioritizes prosperity for the continent. The session over the next 2 hours will cover an overview of the African Climate Foundation strategic framework and will move into a dialogue with our advisory council, who will explore various issues facing the continent around energy access and transitions, as well as the role of public and private sector players in ensuring a just and people-centered energy transition and its intersectionality with development priorities on the continent. We will be giving you an opportunity to send in your questions via the Zoom chat box, and we'll be taking a few of those for responses by our panelists. To kick us off, I'd like to invite Salim Fakir, Executive Director of the African Climate Foundation, to share his reflections on the strategic framework. Salim, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Kateko, and warm welcome to the audience that is and participants, particularly the council members who are joining us for an auspicious day in that we are celebrating two things. That one, we're celebrating the first year of the African Climate Foundation, and also sharing with our audience some of the thinking we've been doing with our council members and many of the key stakeholders across the continent around our strategic framework and the areas we hope to focus on. But I really think this moment is for the council members to really share their reflections. And just to say, as an executive director of a very new foundation, it's really wonderful to have such influential, intellectually stimulating, and if not collegial council members who have engaged with us over 7 meetings, just to put that on record, in helping us think through how we should tackle some of the pressing developmental and climate issues on the African continent. And they have helped to frame this notion of a climate development nexus because they do believe that this is an important period in the history of the world, Africa, and that the issues that the problems we are grappling with, which are broadly developmental issues, particularly now that we face the post-COVID period, that the climate and development nexus issue is not just an environmental issue, that it is a deeply developmental and economic issue. So I really want to give them an opportunity because they have engaged us in a very serious way, in a committed way. And really, I think that it's really a privilege for not only us as a team at HCF, but for the audience also to hear from people who are not very well known as climate experts, but who bring forth really profound views about tackling the climate issues and how they view we should tackle this, not just as ACF, but as a broader community on the African continent. So I think it's really wonderful to have them on board and for them to share this. I just want to say a few things about the ACF and how we've come about with the strategic framework, which the audience participants will get access to on our web very soon. The African Climate Foundation is really a new foundation that is part of a broader dynamic ecosystem of climate foundations around the world. People have probably heard of the European Climate Foundation, they've heard of Climate Works Foundation, many others, but they probably never heard of the African Climate Foundation. So today it's really an opportunity to find out a lot more about what we are about. I think that we have, even though we're tackling climate issues, we have to tackle them in a unique way that have to talk to the context of Africa and the needs of Africa. And therefore, I think that this notion of a climate development nexus, we will come with, we will portray a very different view and lens on it. The ACF is a philanthropic foundation seeded and anchored by the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. We really have to thank them because their vision around building these ecosystem of re-granters is really profound in my view. And the commitment to making sure that these foundations that operate in different regions have autonomy, they're fully capacitated to originate ideas and to find solutions that work best from within the context, and in our case, Africa. I think that there are two important themes that we're trying to establish with the inauguration of the first year of the foundation and the strategic framework is our inter-regional perspective and sensitivity, and also Africa's relationship with the rest of the world. We are not isolated from developments outside Africa, particularly decarbonization ambitions that are being established everywhere else in the world, and the sort of ramping up of the net zero target. The strategic framework that we have come up with is really a guiding document. It's a directional document. It's not detailed. It sets up the strategic thinking. It is work in progress. It will be developed as we consult and talk to many partners across the continent. It just, in terms of the last year, we've engaged over 300 people across the continent. We've had several roundtables, we've done research, and we've had to digest all of that into a very slim thesis of how we think about the climate and development nexus. And as I said, it's not the last word. So there are key areas we want to focus on, largely because we can't cover every ground and every issue. There are many other players that are doing that, but we are definitely interested in energy transitions, land use and agriculture, particularly rural economic transformation from a climate lens, and definitely the future of Africa, which is becoming a lot more urbanized and a youthful continent, and urban transitions would be profoundly important for several reasons. And this is another connector for our strategic framework in terms of infrastructure development, particularly new types of infrastructure, industrial development, and the connectivity that we can provide with digital technologies, which is really an important element of the way we try to think about the climate and development nexus. There are, of course, cross-cutting issues such as youth, gender, health, climate justice, and we want to look at those closely in the 3 thematic areas. We are described as a grant-making foundation, but I would like to say 1 or 2 words on how we think about this. Our model of support is really to build a nested ecosystem in which ACF is one of many players. We will be driven by a strategy in the 3 thematic issues that we focus on. We want to build an ecosystem of actors and partners that can help deliver outcome in a strategy, which is not just about ACF, but is what is needed by the collective, whether it's a national level or regional level. that are important priorities for the continent and that will lead to further new types of economic development and investment. And we see the grants as oiling, oiling this machinery of the ecosystem. It's not giving grants for the sake of giving grants, but it's really about building this network, this ecosystem, and this nested model. And lastly, I would just say that in terms of building capacity, we are looking at two important issues. We want to launch a ACF fellowship, and we will have some high-level individuals that would help us to guide the fellowships, and these fellowships would be to be placed in different institutions at the national and regional level. And we have several pivot countries that we'll be working in, and I can talk about that later. But really, I've done enough talking, and I really want to give this over to the council members for you to take over next. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Salim, for your reflections. I'd like to actually reiterate that the African Climate Foundation Strategic Framework will be live and accessible on our website shortly after the webinar. So please visit our social media and website pages to get more information on the strategic framework. And thank you, Salim, for giving us a very good contextual framing to start us and kick us off with the dialogue with our advisory council members. Now, with 9 years left on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, including other continental agendas, such as Africa Vision 2063, the Addis Accord for Development Financing, amongst others, we cannot shy away from the fact that there is no doubt that climate change will negatively impact Africa's growth and development prospects, particularly in the absence of adaptation and mitigation. Losses of up to 4% of Africa's GDP are projected, and agriculture is a major economic impact driver, given the high share of Africa's GDP accounted for by the sector. So this calls for concerted efforts by African policymakers and development partners to reduce Africa's vulnerability and also bolster Africa's adaptive capacity. Climate finance as well is at the epicenter of dialogue around climate response and at the epicenter of these ambitions. However, to effectively achieve this, Africa needs to adopt an intersectional approach to shape its narrative around a new transformative agenda, a new transformative narrative. With that framing, I'm delighted to introduce to you our African Climate Foundation Advisory Council members. I'd like to introduce Professor Carlos Lopez, an honorary professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. He is a high representative of the Commission of the African Union. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Wanjiru Kamau Rattenberg, Director of the African Women in Agricultural Research and Development. Our third panelist is Adnan Amin, Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and a member of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Group on Climate Change. He's also the Director General Emeritus for ARENA. And lastly, please allow me to welcome Clarice Iribagiza. Clarice is the Chief Executive Officer of Hehe, a leading technology company in Rwanda. A warm welcome to our Advisory Council members, and thank you for joining us today for this very important conversation. Now, what are the biggest threats to the realization of a just transition in Africa? And what are the implications for a failed transition? These are some of the questions that we would like to tackle throughout this conversation. And it is well known that the center tenet of just transition is divesting from fossil fuels. Now, if I may direct a question to Adnan, how do we limit unintended social, economic, and political consequences of a just transition, such as job losses due to divesting from fossil fuels in fossil fuel-driven industries? Adnan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nkateko. And let me say, first of all, what a great pleasure it is to be associated with the Africa Climate Foundation. this is a hugely consequential moment for the future development of Africa in terms of the decisions that African governments will take on very disruptive climate impacts. It's a moment where we have opportunities, but also huge risks. And how we play this in the coming decade will determine how Africa's development will proceed. So I think it's hugely consequential, and the role that the Africa Climate Foundation has to play on this is extremely important, not just catalyzing important interventions, but creating a knowledge framework around which we can catalyze action for climate. Your question is quite broad and quite profound. And I think that you identified the justice issues, social justice issues that are associated both with climate and how we achieve a just transition. And this is an issue that the whole world is facing with right now as we transition from one type of development framework to another. We've already had a little bit of a taste of this. The COVID pandemic has brought home to us what kind of social implications can be associated with disruption. And as one can expect, the disruption has primarily hit low income, especially in urban areas, those who can least afford loss of income, those who don't have access to healthcare, and those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of COVID in a broader economic sense. So as we look forward to the potential impacts of climate, it's going to be extremely important that we learn the lessons of this and we devise our development strategies in a way that takes account of what the social and justice issues are going to be. You talked a little bit about the energy part, which is very much my field. And what we're seeing is actually, for the first time, I've been associated with the climate discussion for 25 years. That's incidentally the reason I have so much white hair. But what has become very clear to me is that we are at an inflection point now. Although the Paris Agreement is more or less a kind of voluntary agreement, what we have seen is countries stepping up with net zero commitments for reaching net zero carbon emissions, mostly by 2050. And big countries, large emitters, have committed to this. Today, we have more than 75% of global GDP covered by net zero commitments, and that is going to alter economic behavior. It's going to alter capital allocation decisions, and it's going to alter the trajectory of economic growth in many countries. So here are the risks. In Africa, we have tremendous opportunities. Africa is a resource-rich region. In terms of energy resources, Africa is extremely wealthy. We haven't benefited tremendously from that wealth as yet, but Africa is number one globally in terms of renewable energy resource potential in virtually every field of energy, of renewable energy, and it's also rich in fossil fuels. What has tended to happen over the last years is that large foreign companies that are interested in investing and extracting fossil fuels from Africa have descended on African governments. We've had African countries that are vested in fossil fuel infrastructure for decades now, some more recent than others. We have billions of dollars invested in that kind of infrastructure. We have a energy transition that has completely changed the matrix of what energy would look like in the future. Renewable energy today is the cheapest on the grid. Even the International Energy Agency, which we've traditionally seen a little bit as fossil friendly, has posited in its last assessment that by 2050, 70% of primary energy will be electricity, and the bulk of that electricity will be renewable. Right now, in terms of primary energy, it's about 8 to 9% renewable. So you can see how transformational this will be for energy systems around the world. There have been a lot of analysis recently about what this means for economies that are vested in fossil fuel infrastructure as producers. And there I see the greatest risk in the African setting. You have countries that are largely dependent on income from fossil fuel. They have largely not diversified their economies in a way that is sustainable without fossil income, and a large part of their workforce is vested in that. We're going to see prices for oil begin to change as we've reached peak demand. Gas is going to be the next in terms of peak demand. Coal has already peaked. And we're going to see incentives for investment in renewables growing. It's going to be a very difficult, transition, because a lot of countries have established rentier economies, and the ruling governments are very much vested in that mode of development. The risk is they may not see the change coming fast enough and not move fast enough. What will happen is that we will have severe disruption in some major economies in Africa: North Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa. We've already begun to see, the issues around the further exploitation of fossil fuel resources in Mozambique. This is going to be something that we're going to see in more and more places. What we need to ensure is that we can meet the development objectives of Africa from its vast renewable energy resources in the future in a way that is socially equitable, and renewable energy lends itself to that. If we look at off-grid access, the bulk of people without access to modern energy services in the world are in Africa. But the biggest change over the last 5 years has happened in Africa, as off-grid standalone solar systems have brought a new perspective to urban populations around the world. New technologies to do with mini-grids, hybrid mini-grids, solar mini-grids have begun to grow, and we see utility scale solar and wind becoming the most competitive on the African grid. We have the ability to generate employment. We have the ability to provide employment for the growing young population of Africa, which has high expectations. And we have the prospect of establishing a more equitable growth path in the future based on an energy transition. If we don't, we will expose our economies to a level of risk that will be compounded by climate change and will create very serious situations in African economies in the coming years.
Thank you, Adnan, for that insightful reflection. But what we are getting from Adnan's presentation is that as we move towards global net zero targets, we need to be alive to the fact that African economies are faced with greater risks. And how do we start thinking about opportunities that help us mitigate that? And if I may, Carlos, call you up, is that how do we identify opportunities, and what opportunities exist for Africa in the medium to long term that demonstrate potential for global and South-South cooperation, for scaling sustainable climate finance, to enhance climate resilience and anti-fragility in support of a clean and just economic recovery agenda?
Thank you. I really believe that we can use this moment, the pandemic era, as a very good marker for what needs to happen. And let me use a metaphor to demonstrate that. We are familiar with the irritating updating of software systems that perturbs our otherwise well-functioning, we believe, computers or smartphones. It normally starts with a prompt that alerts us about the need to update. Otherwise, we may face security problems or malfunctioning resulting from incompatibilities, both in terms of apps or operating systems. And in such situations, we are usually faced with three options. We can replace the device entirely with an enhanced version, and therefore we avoid updating and go through a very complicated situation that may arise over and over. Resist the change and accept that we shall start experiencing some problems and disturbances in the system, or do the updating fast enough to have as little disruption of our preferred options, our preferred apps, our preferred archives and choices. And the dilemma associated with this metaphor are very much present in our daily lives, more often than we care to think. and even less admit. We can imagine systems of governance also prompting us to similar choices, such as how we vote or whether we engage in a form of activism or another. We can think of societies developing their intrinsic dynamics, preferring stability and predictability rather than, adjusting to disruption. But we must admit that we are living in an era of major disruption. We are reminded of it frequently. We are reminded of it with climate change, resulting from weather patterns that are shifting. We can be reminded of it by populist politics, disdain for established rules. We can be reminded of it by the intrusion of automation and robotization, creating new forms of work. There are many manifestations of how these disturbances are becoming more and more present in our daily lives, and therefore, we have to deal with the disruption. And I think COVID-19 is a fresh reminder of this vulnerability and the need for us to adapt very fast. We think of Spanish influenza, that estimated death rate of 50 million a century ago, could have been equally devastating, but it was not, because although the viruses travel now faster, and we have immense capacity to trade and connect, we have also more knowledge about how to act, how to react. We have more capabilities that didn't exist then. And a demonstration of that capability is precisely the speed with which we are finding solutions for the various problems that arise. But we have to admit that the current crisis, provoking one of the most dramatic economic contractions of modern times, took about 3 weeks to get to the dramatic falls in economic activity that were attained by the Great Depression in 3 years. So this is a contraction of time also, horizon, from 3 years to 3 weeks. And therefore, despite all the capabilities that we have demonstrated, we are still not capable of having a fast enough response that will avoid the disruption. So if we have to deal with disruption, we have to prepare a sophisticated response. And that sophisticated response, when it comes to Africa, is very much limited by the exposure of our vulnerabilities to systemic issues that do not really allow Africa to act the same way as other regions. And this is very much present in the financing dimensions. So access to finance has become problematic before this pandemic. It was already problematic for a variety of reasons, despite new developments in the economic global governance system, acceptance of certain forms of Keynesianism, questioning of macroeconomic orthodoxy, putting aside of monetarist policies. All of these things were happening, but they have been accelerated since. And then we saw the gap between what others can actually contest, challenge, and actually reject even, and countries in Africa that are very vulnerable, that are still being judged against a very prescriptive set of conditionalities. How do we overcome that? The only way we can overcome that is by entering into these debates with much more forceful agency. We, for instance, hear about green bonds. We hear about a number of possibilities that are offered by sustainable financing. And we have to actually admit that most of these instruments for the moment are not yet taking into account the intricacies and the difficulties that the Africans are facing. And the only way we are going to be able to respond properly to these debates is by being prepared. And that's one of the tasks of the African Climate Foundation, is to make sure that it's part of this ecosystem of capability construction that is going to allow us to respond better.
Thank you, Carlos, for that. Basically, the debate is growing around climate response, climate finance, but also there are equally other contesting ideas and proposals around the need for a massive overhaul of the economic system and the economic structure. And largely this is part of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also this allows us to start thinking about what kind of levers in other sectors could we start activating to build African economies in the context of the just transition? And I'd like to open a question to the floor, to all our panelists in terms of what opportunities exist for Africa to identify returns from the transition from zero carbon emissions, and how can other sectors such as agriculture tap into this and leverage this? Please, any takers?
I can go first. Hello, everyone. Wanjiro here. It's an honor to be here and to be alongside my esteemed colleagues on the advisory panel. I think and we've heard a lot about energy, which is a really important angle into the climate change conversation. And I also just want to bring in agriculture. You mentioned agriculture in passing, and I think when you look at the percentage of Africa's population that depends on agriculture for livelihood, I think it's going to be really important that when you look at Africa's future, the agricultural sector and the proposals that are being made for improving the efficiency and efficacy of Africa's agricultural sector don't become massive contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and the like. And so I think we as a continent, coming from the perspective of the agriculture sector, we as a continent are actually at a fork in the road where we're needing to make important decisions about will the reforms that are proposed for Africa's agricultural sector allow us to actually address issues and the challenges of climate change, or will we end up with an agricultural sector that is a leading emitter, as has happened in many other parts of the world, which, now that conversation about, especially animal farming and methane into the atmosphere. Yet we know, I think it's going to be really important to thread a thin line there. We know that we've got massive pastoralist populations across the continent. So even how we address questions of methane then become really important to be culturally contextual. But then, I'll talk a bit later about the role that research can play in helping us make sure that the future is one that is, I think, contextually relevant solutions are going to be really critical. So I just wanted to bring that in there.
Thanks, Wanjiru. And I think this gives us a nice segue into the next question. I mean, we've seen with the massive challenges that have come with the COVID-19 pandemic, one of which is a threat to food security. And so failures in the global food system can precipitate massive social unrest and political strife as well, with irreversible implications for sustainable livelihoods. How can African countries, including the African Continental Free Trade Area, unlock economic growth potential and climate resilience in African countries?
I think the first thing to appreciate is the critical central importance of the agriculture sector in Africa's economies, and not just at the GDP level, but in terms of livelihoods. And then to appreciate that the agricultural sector is, if not the one of the most deeply affected by climate change. And the effects of climate change are happening at a time where we as a continent are in the midst of a population growth boom, right? So we've got this demographic dividend, and it will only be a dividend if we can feed our people, right? So our farmers have had decades of being unempowered and underinvested in. we're asking the same poor farmers, smallholder farmers, to feed an increasing number of people and to do it in climate conditions that make it incredibly difficult to grow even the quantities of food we were able to grow in the past. Whether you're looking at fall armyworm outbreaks or the locusts, the agricultural sector is important to the climate change conversation, and climate change is important to the African agricultural sector. And so understanding that nexus is really important. Now, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I do think the Africa Free Trade, Continental Free Trade area has tremendous opportunities, presents tremendous opportunities for the continent. I think a lot of, when you look across the continent, a lot of what we trade amongst ourselves and across countries is actually agricultural produce. It's tempting to think about the cereals, the dry cereals, but we also do a lot of trade, for example, in things like cotton, right? Those of us who love our African print, that cotton is an agricultural product. And so if we actually extend our thinking and our appreciation of what constitutes the agriculture sector, we then appreciate that so much of what we as Africans trade amongst each other is actually agricultural produce. And I think if we can get to a place of harmonizing standards, for example, so that, for example, in Kenya, we've got a challenge with Uganda, where grain and milk products and egg products from Uganda are blocked at the Kenyan border because the standards for what is considered a safe level of humidity in the grain, for example, is not the same in the two countries. So if we can figure out and harmonize those standards, we then make it a lot more possible to, and the trade area is supposed to really eliminate those non-tariff barriers. And if we can iron those out, I think we then position Africa's agricultural sector to be in a place where we're not just securing the livelihoods, especially of smallholder farmers, we're actually enabling real prosperity of our agricultural producers. But let me stop there with that answer.
Thanks, Wanjiru. And I think you raised some very important issues there, especially issues that touch on the socio-economic impact of climate. And I think we need to look at those and consider interventions that also tap into other sectors, such as agriculture, to boost economic development, as well as create meaningful economic participation for our people in the continent. But as we navigate this climate development nexus, Wanjiru, and with the upcoming UN Food Systems Summit, is how could we potentially leverage research and analysis on food systems to influence policymaking on climate change? And what are the key proposals, issues, emerging ideas that you may have, or innovations that you could share with us related to the future of food systems in Africa? And what of those could be pushed by civil society in the lead up to the UN Food Systems Summit?
Thank you. It's a great question. I think let me refer to what Carlos referred to as forceful agency, and the need for Africans to bring an agency to the table in these global conversations. And again, COVID continues to emerge as a theme. I think one of the things, or at least I hope one of the things we as Africans are learning from this pandemic, and some of the lessons emerging, is the absolute importance of having our own research infrastructure on the continent. For far too long, we've been expecting others to do research for us, others to do development of innovative products, and then we adapt for the continent. And in certain ways, we've been kind of caught flat-footed so that when certain countries say, hey, we're going to take care of our pandemic at home, we're going to not export our medicines because we've got a problem here, we as a continent are left sicker. And so I'm really hoping that these lessons in terms of doing not just basic research research, but also being able to do not just the upstream, but also downstream and manufacturing highly technical products is something that we as a continent commit to, that our governments commit to putting budget behind, because we really can't expect to continue waiting on others to solve those problems for us. I think agricultural research falls within, again, falls within that high priority category, because we all eat. We all have to eat. Unfortunately, as a continent, not all of our children especially are getting the meals and the nutrition that they need, but it's an absolute need. So when you think about an area that is essential for our governments to invest in, the capacity to be able to come up with contextually relevant solutions for our people are critical. And think about something as simple as so many of the climate models that we're relying on to understand what climate change is going to look like on this continent. So many of those models, none of those models have been developed on the continent. And so many of them are using data that's collected off the continent. We are not training enough of our scientists, and we're not funding enough of our any scientists to actually collect data on, for example, what's happening over the Congo Basin, so that we can predict across East Africa or across Southern Africa what rainfall patterns are going to look like. And so that's in things that are so basic, so that we can actually be able to tell our farmers it's going to rain, or we're going to expect things to get drier, or we're going to expect things to get wetter, and prepare them. Things that basic we're not yet able to do. Technologies, basic technologies such as agroforestry, being able to understand and to tell our farmers, hey, plant this particular tree, it works really well, it'll enhance your crop of this particular crop, plant these combinations in this particular field. These are simple technologies that are not heavy investments, yet we as a continent are still not leaning into that as hard as we could. And then finally, when it comes to the Food Systems Summit itself, one of the things that I'd love to see is a closer relationship and interrogation of the nexus between food systems and climate change. Unfortunately, the climate change folk are having their own conversations, and the food systems folk, just even getting conceptually agreeing to call something a food system has been a journey. So finally, we've gotten to agree, they are food systems. Okay, now we need to understand that these food systems are dependent upon climate, and also the kinds of food systems we advocate and build are going to have massive implications on whether we accelerate global warming or not. Yeah, so thank you.
Thanks, Wanjiru. It's interesting that you've mentioned what's happening in the Congo Basin and subsequent implications for sustainable livelihoods. But also this also shows us that there are other priorities and challenges that the African continent is facing regarding governance issues, illicit financial flows, which continue to plummet our economies, and looking at the fact that we are trying to move towards getting solutions and developing solutions on how we respond to these various challenges, is the sense that we need to think about a more intersectional approach to solutions formulation. And one of that makes me think, Wanjiru, is the fact that, as we move towards industrialization, a conversation that comes with the just transition and the move towards net zero carbon emissions targets, we ought to consider what role technology can play in all of this. And I think Clarice Iribagiza, who is here with us, can reflect a little bit around how technology and innovation could encourage solutions around some of the issues that Wanjiru placed, but equally so, how can this encourage youth participation in climate action?
Right, thank you so much, Kateko. And I'm really glad to be here, and just listening to this rich, full discussion has been an utmost pleasure for me. I'll just say that Africa is, we're really living in interesting times where we have a huge youthful population that should be engaged in climate conversations, climate research to drive innovations. But also we're living in times where we have access to technologies that can really impact the climate sector. And I believe that the combination of the two, just the youthful population and having access to these digital technologies or technologies in general, play a really critical role in driving innovations that can really transform this climate conversation that we're having. And for just to speak to, how can we really leverage these demographics that we have? We need to engage youth in conversations like this, because for me, being on the Africa Climate Foundation, our foundation's advisory council has helped me connect the dots between the two. How can the technology innovations that I'm building in agriculture, in e-commerce, that are impacting trade, how can I connect them to how they can play a role in the climate conversation that we're having? So this is one important thing that we need to do for youth. How can we connect those dots? And for me, that's been the journey that I've been taking on this council, connecting those dots. And I'm grateful for the guidance from Carlos, from Adnan, and Wanjiru, and Salim as well, just being able to have that conversation. Secondly, R&D. This is something that Wanjiru alluded to, and it's important that we invest in research and development. Our young people are doing a lot of innovative things, but the funding is not necessarily readily available. And again, just tying that funding to climate change, that's something that we need to be able to do, but also opportunities to upskill our young people. There's lots of opportunities that exist in various technology frontiers, but our young people don't necessarily have the skills. So the opportunity to upskill them and equip them to be able to play an important role that will impact the African continent and make us climate resilient in sectors like agriculture, trade are important. So just helping us connect those dots, providing access to funding for R&D, and this is a critical role that the private sector can also play, not just governments and not just development partners, but also upskilling the youth. This will go a long way in addressing the issues around climate on the continent.
Thank you, Clarice. It's interesting that you've mentioned the shortage of funding in support of research and development in this area. And you've touched on, the private sector being able to play a catalytic role in support of this. Could you share some reflections on a few examples in terms of how the private sector could facilitate this kind of support, including tapping into access to funding to support various initiatives?
Yeah, sure. I think we did, for example, with the Africa Climate Foundation Fellowship Program. This is a great opportunity for private sector players to be engaged, and if there are opportunities for capacity development that they see within their organizations with a partnership with the Africa Climate Foundation Fellowship Program, this is a good starting point. Having fellows embedded within their organizations just to support them to build capacity as an organization and how they as an organization can address climate challenges. That's the first opportunity. But obviously, committing resources to R&D within their organizations is important. Most developed countries will have maybe up to 3 to 4% of their GDP dedicated to R&D, and this is not just done by governments. This is also done by private sector players. So that's something that organizations could also do to make sure that we are committing enough resources, not to just be on the receiving end of whatever technologies and innovations come our way, but also we are setting the trends, and we're innovating in ways that make sense for our communities and that make sense for our economies. So that's another way that the private sector could also be engaged, but also obviously helping influence policy by sharing data, information. I think we did mention that a lot of the data that we have is not necessarily, best of all, information from the continent, but organizations on the continent could play a critical role in helping our policymakers have, data-driven decision making by sharing really critical data. So those are some of the three ways that I can think of, but I'm sure there's many opportunities for the private sector to also play a critical role here.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the private sector and business community need to be brought into the conversation around co-creating solutions. And while I have you, Clarice, perhaps if you could reflect for us a little bit on which key levers in the tech and innovation sector can be utilized to scale down carbon-intensive productions, but also boost zero-carbon localized manufacturing and production on the continent. So what exciting innovations could we look out for and begin to think through as we develop our pathway to a clean, just energy transition?
Sure, that's a great question, and I will highlight two key areas that I see opportunities. We could leverage the efficiencies that technologies bring to supply chains. I'll speak particularly to the agriculture supply chain. We could, mitigate issues like post-harvest losses with just more efficient distribution, leveraging technologies around e-commerce, where you're able to map demand and supply and then efficiently allocate resources to that. That's one really good opportunity, and we've been doing a lot of interesting work in that area where we focus on, more demand-driven agriculture and demand-driven distribution, as opposed to simply bringing produce to market without the certainty of getting consumers. So that's one low-hanging fruit. Nothing complicated about that we could an interesting innovation. But also this could be extended to all forms of manufacturing and production, where instead of forecasting what the demand might be, you can actually have data on this demand, and your entire manufacturing and production is based off of data from the consumers. And you're able to produce just what you need and deliver it to your consumers just in time. But there are also a lot of other innovative things in agriculture, like using remote sensing for more sustainable agriculture, climate smart agriculture solutions that leverage remote sensing, just to be able to measure what the amount of carbon emissions, or incentivize farmers to be able to just have more smart, climate smart agriculture practices. There are a lot of exciting things happening on the technology front.
Thank you so much. I think this has been a very rich and fruitful conversation. And some of the key things that are coming out from this conversation is the fact that, the African continent is very rich in mineral resources. And while we are progressing towards reaching these global net zero targets, we are also facing risks that could potentially affect our economies. And so as we think about solutions moving us forward, we need to have in mind what are the intersections between climate and development. And I think there's some interesting things that are coming up from yourselves, Clarice, Wanjiru, that speak to some of the social economic impacts that we need to look out for as we co-create solutions to this, while tapping into the broader political issues that Adnan and Carlos have reflected upon. So I'd like to thank you for your reflections, and I'd like to steer our conversation to look at the geopolitics of climate, as well as climate diplomacy, and to just get a sense of where are the entry points, what is Africa's positioning, and to also tap into the existing narratives that we're seeing. One thing that we can see from the sector is the fact that there are competing narratives in terms of what Africa's trajectory should look like in terms of energy transitions. And so we're trying to unpack this in this session, and I would like to invite Carlos to tackle a question that looks at the whole world of decarbonization and how this is increasingly becoming a priority. What role can Africa play to ensure the enforcement of true accountability in the face of obstinate national interests, such as the agenda that is driven, for example, by the United States, China, Russia, etc. So what key positions could we start to consider around that? Carlos, please.
Well, when referring to COVID situation, and I'm asked often to emit my opinion, I normally start by saying Africa is the most affected and the least infected, or vice versa. Is the least infected, but the most affected. Least infected from a sanitary point of view, the most affected from a social and economic point of view. What is new if we were talking about climate instead of COVID, instead of a virus? It will be the same. The one that pollutes the least and emits the least is the one that is the most impacted by climate change. So we always find ourselves in this situation where the need for transformation becomes imperative, because the only way we are going to change the pattern is by making sure that Africa is part of a complete transformation. And that starts already with the potential that exists with what I can call strategic minerals, all this mineral wealth that is going to be fundamental for the transitions of the future, that are absolutely indispensable for high tech, indispensable for electric vehicles and other forms of decarbonizing. And are we going to have another wave of Africa's commodity dependence? Because that's basically what we have lived since the colonial times. So each time that there is a new wave of technological changes, this time also pushed by climate imperatives, we are boxed in a sort of comparative advantage of just doing what we have as natural wealth. And this natural wealth is killing us because it's not being used as a transformative element. And we need to change this pattern. And I think the geopolitics of today are demonstrating with the vaccines, and it's very relevant for the green discussion, are demonstrating with vaccines a me first policy attitude. And this me first policy attitude is now going to be translated into all these mentioned, green deals. You have the European Green Deal, the US Green Deal, all these green deals are most welcome. But if they are going to be done with the imposition of standards, rules, fiscal policies for the rest that do not take into account our reality, they are going again to box us in situations that will not allow us for our climate transition to take place. And we are going to be, told that we should contribute to mitigation and decarbonization, which obviously we would love to. But, that's not the only objective that should be assigned to Africa. Africa should be part of the solution for the net zero targets, not just being boxed as the corner where you can mitigate. Because how do you do that? You impose, for instance, a carbon tax. Then you will allow imports into the countries or blocks that impose a carbon tax based on certification. We don't have the certification. We don't have the standards. Therefore, we are going to be considered as contributing to carbon unless we do the things that are determined for us, which will be commodity dependence. So, because anything that we'll do that is industrial or that is processed or that is transformed will not have the standards, will not have the certifications, so it cannot enter. So you continue to export minerals because that's your contribution to net zero. And that is the assigned role that will be given because of a new fiscal apparatus that will impede us from progressing. So this is the geopolitical dimension of this battle for net zero. We are all in it or we are not in it. We have to be part of the solution, not just being boxed as the lateral player that continues to be, because of its comparative advantage, poor and not having access to the latest, being it green technology, being it sophisticated value chains and the like. So it depends on how the forceful agency 1.0 is exercised, because that's the way we are going to demonstrate that through negotiation, through our positions, that we are no longer the corner of adaptation. We love adaptation, we'll do it, but don't box us just on that.
Thank you, Carlos. And what does this mean for EU-Africa relations, for example, China-Africa relations? What opportunities do you see there? Because what I'm getting from your presentation is the fact that the time for doing things the same way is no longer viable. So we need to massively change how we do things, how we come to the table as the continent, as well as how we completely transform our economies. So I just would like you to share a few reflections on what perhaps this means for partnerships in our context.
For our partners in Europe, the most important block in terms of relations with Africa, be it in trade, be it investment or ODA, we have just to keep mentioning that don't patronize us. Don't tell us that we should do this and that on the environment or to defend the climate. We have our own agenda, and it's an agenda that has the same universal principles and the same universal objectives as yours, but it's a different agenda. It's not the same agenda, because the priorities for Africa are different. We need to industrialize, and this industrialization has to be a green industrialization. We have no reasons to go through the various steps that others have gone through that are now considered not the most justified from a climate perspective, but also from a productive perspective. So it is in our advantage to leapfrog, and we cannot leapfrog with the current regimes of intellectual property. We cannot leapfrog without some changes in trade regimes. We cannot leapfrog without, rethinking the notion of risk that has associated risk to Africa, because normally, we have considered that Africa is the terrain of conflict, is the terrain of bad governance and all that. I always keep reminding my interlocutors that Thailand had 13 coups, and it's progressing in terms of access to capital. Nobody has any problems putting lots of factories in Thailand. It's a big exporter of manufacturing and agricultural products. Nobody talks about crisis there when it comes to economic investment. 13 coups. And we can multiply examples like that. So don't associate risk just with Africa. You see, the rating agencies consider Africa as a terrain of danger. You see, there is only one country in Africa that is not in non-speculative category by all rating agencies. That's Botswana. Really? The second fastest growing region in the world after Southeast Asia, pre-pandemic, with the forecast of the IMF in January 2020, predicting that 21 African countries will have rates of growth of 5% or more, comprehending half of the population of the continent, is considered just speculative, when the return of investment is the highest in the world, according to UNCTAD. So we need to change these things. And I think the Chinese understand it faster than the Europeans, but the Chinese also are playing smart. They are exporting through infrastructure that is not sustainable. I love the railways that are being built across Africa, and it's better than not having them. But these railways are using technologies that the Chinese don't use anymore. They are exporting it because they are progressing theirs to the net zero targets. And so this is just one example of how we, find ourselves in a situation where sometimes we don't get the best of the deals because we need to be very clear about our agenda. I believe we have one. I believe it's different. So we have to join forces with the like-minded that want to address climate, that are very much mobilized by climate action. And I salute the fact that both Europe and China are in that category. And we need to work together, but we have a different agenda.
Thank you, Carlos. I think this gives me a very interesting segue to move over to Adnan. Adnan, there is a whole new debate on economic transformation that is opening up in the geopolitical space as a result of the energy transition itself, looking at trade, investment, finance, technology and innovation, and raw materials. With Africa being a resource-rich continent, what does this mean for development on the continent? And I'd like you to dig a little bit deeper. I know Carlos mentioned the carbon border taxes and other initiatives that could be implemented to bring us to the table as an equal playing partner. So if you could share your reflections in terms of where this could take us and what the trajectory is for the continent in that regard.
Thank you. And it's been a fascinating discussion. It's brought a lot of thoughts to mind, but I've also been looking with one eye at the questions, and there's some excellent questions that have been posed. So I'll try and address some of those issues. And let me start with the issue of mitigation. Africa contributes less than 4% of the global total of carbon annually. To ask Africa to decarbonize is faintly ridiculous, because even if we take the effort in a continent that has so many development challenges to impose a cost on development to decarbonize, we will make no contribution in terms of what the global situation is. And the responsibility is on the major emitters of the world. And this is what we have to continue to insist on strategically in the climate negotiations, in trade negotiations, that the responsibility for mitigation is with major emitters, and that must have a reflection in one way or another. And one of those reflections must be now that we've moved into this new post-Paris phase, that all of these agreements we've had since the Copenhagen conference, where developed countries promised up to $100 billion in terms of financing, have not been met. If you want Africa to move in a clean development direction, then concessional financing from donors needs to be made available without conditions, contingent on the development plans that Africans have in place, as long as they comply with some climate resilience, adaptation issues and so on. So I think that's one thing that we must insist on, is that the mitigation debate, we should not impose unnecessary penalties on our own development to accord with mitigation, while there's a global responsibility for that, which is not being met. And we need, in our negotiation stance, to make a big issue of that. And we need to continue to follow that. There's also a question of, do we talk about a transition when we also have 60% of Africans without access to modern energy services? It's a good question, but my answer would be that we do have to transition to a new energy matrix based on the resource endowment on Africa, based on the fact that technology today is available that provides clean electricity from renewables at costs which on the grid are cheaper than conventional power generation, and the fact that the future of energy is going to be increasingly electrification, and the fact that we have, I was listening to Clarice very carefully. It's so important that we understand the significance of the adoption of new technologies, digitalization. And I'm in touch with so many young African entrepreneurs who are introduced to investors and startup capital and so on, who are working on the intersection of distributed energy, smart grids, distributed solar resources, digitalization, remote management of energy assets in developing countries in Africa, which bodes extremely well, in my view, for the whole issue of electrification, without having to spend huge amounts of capital in the infrastructure of distribution that's required. I mean, we cannot start building out major grid infrastructure with the capital that's needed right now. We need to start looking at distributed solutions, which are now available. That's the transition I'm talking about. This is how we electrify those who do not have access to modern energy services, access to electricity and modern energy services. It's transformational in people's lives in rural areas. And I think that's an area where we must focus, energy access. That's a development strategy in its own, I think, and that's in our hands. That's for us to do. We have the capability to do it. We're not being stopped by anybody. We're not being pushed by anybody. And we need to seek partnerships increasingly that allow us to do that. The other is that Africa is, Carlos has spoken very eloquently about the issue of materials and resources. We come from a similar kind of development studies background where we've seen with dismay over the last decades how Africa has received pennies on the dollar for the resources that have been taken out unprocessed from Africa's soil and exported overseas. A loss of capital that has had huge implications for African development. That, in fact, has been one of the sources of underdevelopment in economies in Africa. I think the opportunity is there today to look strategically at what is going to be the material base for this new economy that is going to come about. There's a whole discussion about rare earth materials. In fact, rare earth materials are not that rare. They're available in many places. It's only a question of investment in exploitation of rare earth materials. And that has begun to happen as people want lithium for electric cars, et cetera, et cetera. But there are strategic resources that Africa has. If you look at the commodity prices today, you'll see copper is going up tremendously. Electrification is going to increase demand for copper. We need to keep an eye on that. Cobalt. Africa is a big source of cobalt. Many of the countries that are now moving on electric mobility are already trying to lock in deals that are potentially disadvantageous for Africa on cobalt supply that lasts for 20 years. And I think that we need to develop a strategy on materials that is looking forward at what kind of demand is going to be there, how African decision makers need to respond to that, and how do we negotiate agreements, and how do we have value added, not just exportation of raw materials, but value added in production processes, in manufacturing on African soil that generates employment. If we don't generate employment, given that we have a young and growing population, if we don't generate employment for youth in most African countries today, I think the social consequences and political consequences of that are going to be dire. You can see it in many of the large cities around Africa. I was just home in Nairobi the other day. I have to pay for that with quarantine for 10 days, but nevertheless, it was really instructive to me to see how quickly the population has grown. The fact that there is a huge vitality in the youth in Kenya, the fact that the access to the internet, the access to new technologies, education, and digitalization has created a completely new consciousness about what the future could look like among the youth. And we are not powerless people. I think that we can really begin to make a change in terms of how we think this through. If you look at why other countries are doing this, I've been involved a lot in energy transition discussions recently. I was last night on one Financial Times discussion on US energy policy, including with a former energy advisor for President Obama and a number of other Americans. And clearly, the US position is that the energy economy of the future is going to be clean. It's going to be based on new types of materials. It's going to be based on new types of power generation and distribution. It's going to be smarter. It's going to be cleaner. And it's going to be where the economic wins are. That's where wealth generation is going to start happening in this new economy. And that is why the Biden administration is focusing so much on this, not only as a climate issue. You can always dress it up as a climate issue. It's an economic, strategic, competition, geopolitical issue today. There is a tremendous fear in Europe and in the United States that somehow, while they were sleeping, China stole forward on all the sectors of growth that we are going to see in the future. They invested in electric mobility. They are in the lead on battery manufacturing. Battery manufacturing is going to be the lifeblood of electricity and electric mobility and many other productive uses in the future. Many of those materials that are available for this are in Africa. We need to start to think of ourselves strategically as part of a global value chain and to extract the most value we can from that positioning with a very clear understanding of what trade means for us, what kind of trade agreements have to be made, what kind of local manufacturing value added we have to have in the continent, and how we start to give access to electricity and sustainable economic growth to the population. I think this is the critical geopolitical challenge today. Somebody asked a question about what do we think of the IEA. The IEA just took out its net zero report. It was welcomed by many because it signaled the IEA for the first time breaking with its orthodoxy of continuously undervaluing renewables deployment while looking at solutions that included some kind of lower carbon fossils. I think they're over that. They understand now that for the 1.5 degree scenario, the energy sector has to change completely, and the economic conditions and the technological conditions are there for that to happen. So I think that recognition is very welcome, but they made another very important point. This is a point I had when I was the head of IRENA. I debated this many times with the head of the IEA, even in public, quite interesting debates. But basically, they have recognized for the first time that the energy transition has a net positive for global GDP growth. And that's also reflected at the regional level. And we need to understand the implications of that for Africa in terms of sustainable growth. Our focus should be 1, on adaptation, and 2, on developing a resilient growth framework that is sustainable, that is low carbon, and that is economically viable, and that generates social benefits and employment as we go forward. I think this is the critical aspect of the energy transition we need to keep in mind. My last point on this, there is a huge preoccupation that as we move into smarter, interconnected, distributed systems, cybersecurity has become a big issue. And you know, as I said before, one of the most exciting things for me is looking at the technical capability of young people coming out of educational institutions in Africa today, but also the kind of startups, the energy I see in many of the urban areas in Africa. These young kids, you know, for me, they're kids still. I see them like, you know, same age as my kids. These kids speak a language I struggle to understand. They're on the margins of this new kind of thinking about technology that we never had access to. And they are developing new and innovative ways of dealing with the development issues across agriculture, across food security, across water management, and across energy today, that I think that there's so much energy in this. And I can tell you the other thing, you know, we talk about destinations for investment. I talked to, since I left IRENA, what happened is that a lot of people who want to invest capital, and there's a lot of money around, have started looking for people to tell them where they can go. And a lot of these funds are coming to me to learn more about Africa and asking me to introduce them to startups in Africa. And I do it with great pleasure because I see the amazement that they have when they meet these young African kids who are speaking a language which is at the cutting edge of fintech, of digitalization, of management of data that is now happening. This is the ecosystem we must nurture. And we need to do it with a new mindset, and we need to do it with a mindset that is strategic in our geopolitical engagement and looking for where we can get strategic advantages for Africa. And this is one of the things we're discussing in the ACF. Can we develop a line of thinking that is indigenous to Africa, that is looking at African interests for the energy transition, and can that become part of the global discourse as part of the broader climate discussion? And I'm very hopeful that that could be a very interesting thing to do.
Thank you, Adnan. Great insights, great reflections. And I think it's building to the richness of this conversation. And as we think about moving forward and shaping our strategic positioning, I think it's also good for us to start thinking, how do we influence policy narratives for both state and non-state actors? And I'd like to call on to Clarice to share with us a few of her reflections in terms of how we could actually influence these players, as well as ensure that we facilitate positive dialogue and the co-creation of multi-level solutions.
Great, thank you. I mean, I'll just echo a lot of things that Adnan has mentioned. And I see an important role that young people can play in helping, address these policy issues that you just mentioned. I think for me, just being able to equip young people with knowledge, information, skills, and the funding to play a much more meaningful role in engaging in these conversations around policy and co-creating solutions is the starting point for me. There's a lot that I have learned from being involved with the Africa Climate Foundation and how that's guiding, for example, how we build products or how we build solutions that are impactful for our communities around climate change. And for us to be able to play a more meaningful role, the knowledge, the skills, the capital is going to be very critical for us. So I think we need to put money that will de-risk investing in innovative solutions on the continent for climate change is going to be important, and policies that can also help drive the adoption of these innovations are going to be very critical. So, just being able to, see an uptake and scale of the solutions that young people are building will go a long way in, first of all, of course, de-risking that, but also just driving that innovative energy. And policies can play a very critical role in that. So I really hope that this is something we start to see around the continent, not only just engaging young people, but also investing in their innovations and just putting in place policies that drive the adoption of these innovations.
Thank you, Clarice. Thanks for that. I'd like to bring in Wanjiru to the floor. Wanjiru, and based on Clarice's reflections, what do you think is missing in the just transition and green economic recovery narrative in terms of the various sectors, the stakeholders that are involved? What's missing in the narrative that you think would add value to the conversation and debate?
Thank you. And this is such a fascinating conversation, and I'm learning so much. It's hard not to furiously scribble away on notes. I wouldn't say things that are missing. I would say perhaps perspectives that I'd love to see amplified, more amplified. One is that this conversation, and it's come up today already, but I'd love to see it more amplified on the global stage, if you will. We're having the conversation and the debate on the development climate nexus in the context of post-coloniality. So the relationships that our countries, that our states have had. First of all, we need to appreciate the origins of the African state, our colonial origins. These are mechanisms that were designed from inception to extract. And so I think just a real recognition of what we're, the uphill battle that we are on might change or intensify certain focus. So that's one. And then something else that we're talking a lot about leapfrogging, and I absolutely agree. And I think for me, it's going to be so important that leapfrogging also be a leapfrogging that puts social issues of human rights, and especially issues of gender equality at the center of what we envision for the future. When we're saying we want to avoid the mistakes that others have made, the things that were not helpful in other parts of the world as they were, quote, developing and growing their economies, I think gender equality and social, more inclusive societies, more inclusive access ought to be at the center of how we shape and frame our leapfrogging. So those are the two things that I'd love to see.
Thanks, Wanjiru. And what are the key takeaways for this? What role can civil society and philanthropy play in supporting broader inclusion, supporting climate initiatives, as you've just reflected?
Well, let's start with and so one of the participants posted this in the chat, the importance of human rights, right? As we're talking about access to how we make use of our materials and how we leverage our mineral wealth. Issues, I think, of human rights are going to be really central, and I think we also need to yes, civil society plays an important role in placing human rights and constantly reminding us of the importance of human rights, but it's human rights is something we should all care about. Our governments ought to care about human rights, as private sector ought to care about human rights, and so human rights is something that I would love to see again, and I guess using that same language brought more to the fore. I think it's going to be important for philanthropy to walk a thin line around, it's not about money setting the agenda. It's about using money and resources to amplify the voices of those on the ground who have often been left, whose voices have often been left off, muted in that global conversation. And so I think for us at ACF is really thinking clearly and carefully about how do we, leverage and amplify those voices that are maybe not the norm, not the common voices in these discussions. I think it's going to be really important to also have these conversations and debate within the context of understanding democratic transitions and the places that are where we are as a continent in terms of our own democratic journeys. And that's quite tied into the conversation about human rights, but it's also that democracy and governance issues. And I think someone else put that on the chat. Democracy and governance issues are going to be central to again, not just the conversations about rare earth minerals and access to that and compensation for local communities. They're going to be important in agriculture and, having African peoples have a real conversation and a real debate and decision-making around, for example, technology, around GMO, for example. Very quickly you move into questions of democracy and of governance and representation and having people's voices, really the demos. How do we as ACF, but more broadly as all of us who are passionate about this climate conversation, make sure that the demos remains at the center of decision making, and how do we understand what the demos, what the people, how do we capture their voices and their preferences? It's going to be important. And then finally, I think our governments just have, and here I'm going to just go a little bit down a rabbit hole, back into the space that I know quite well, research, and in particular agricultural research. For as long as research, and especially agricultural research, but I imagine other forms of research that feed into this climate conversation, for as long as that research is funded by players who are off the continent, African researchers will continue to, what is that thing about dance to whoever pays the piper calls a tune? And it's going to be, it's so critically important. Again, COVID showed us, but really some of the crises we're seeing in agriculture are showing us that it's so important for our governments to make the investments and to live up to the commitments they've made, whether it's under CADEP, under the Malabo Declaration, to really, and CISA, to live up to their commitments that they've made to fund research, because only then can our scientists start, and they are ready, they're eager, but the funding for research is coming from off the continent. And so we're being talked about, we're not doing the talking about. This is the landscape of our problem. This is the shape and curves of the challenges we're facing. And these are the proposals for solutions by people who spent their childhoods dealing with and living around those problems. And I think these things do matter. So let me stop there.
Some thought-provoking reflections from Wanjiru there, and great insights in terms of the key takeaways that civil society, private actors, governments, and philanthropy can consider as we move forward with our efforts towards a just transition. I'd like to open up and take a few questions from the Q&A. The first question that I'd like the panelists to respond to is from Dumba Katabua, who says, given the force coercion to forego fossil fuels and adopt renewable energy, what does this transition mean for Africa's development? Are there precedents to demonstrate the correlation between green energy and development? Yes, Adnan, please have a go at it.
That's a good question, and I think it's very important for us now to reflect in the next phase of development in Africa. How will that development be powered? How will it be fueled? We're seeing that the world of energy is changing. We're looking at all of the kind of financial analysts that are today estimating that we could have $7 trillion of stranded assets in the oil and gas industry worldwide as the energy transition moves. And we're living in a world where renewable energy costs have fallen dramatically. Today, we have record prices for solar generation, which are below 2 cents a kilowatt hour in many countries. New gas is around 8 to 14 cents a kilowatt hour, if that is the alternative. We're seeing wind energy prices have fallen. Geothermal, where you have the resource, like in Kenya. Kenya has done a fantastic job on geothermal energy. And we have biomass in Africa. So, and hydro, I mean, there has been a discussion for a long time about can we use sustainably the hydro resources in Africa to power Africa's development. The interconnection of African economies in an electrical system creates a situation where low-cost renewable energy can overcome the constraints of intermittency, because you will have, and this was one of the great visions we had in IRENA from the early days, is to create an integrated power market in Africa where different sources of energy can balance each other, where electricity trade takes place. And as the free trade agreement advances, this becomes a potential reality as we move forward. A well-regulated electricity market, low carbon power, incentivized by climate finance that is received on preferential terms as a kind of stimulant to this kind of investment. There is today a business case for that. And I think that that is potentially, in my view, the way that we are going to power industrial development in the future, as well as resolve the issue of energy access and unleash the productive power of unelectrified people in rural areas where this is a life-changing issue. So I think that the choice is very clear. And just take a few examples in Africa. I think the gentleman you mentioned his question, he also mentioned Germany not being, you have German electricity systems with more than 50% intermittent renewable energy who are interconnected with hydro sources, and their reliability is the best that you have anywhere. You have a huge renewable energy capacity being put in China. And all of this is to our benefit because doubling of capacity reduces costs of renewable technology over time. So we are dealing with historically low cost renewable energy today. What we need is a regulatory framework, an investment climate, some stability, the ability to access finance that can help to de-risk this kind of investment that can drive the transformation of our power sector and create a new energy future for us. And I think it's a no-brainer. And that's why I mentioned very early on that we should look strategically at how Africa interfaces in the climate negotiation to ensure that the climate finance that is being discussed is the type of climate finance that can be used for these purposes because it reduces mitigation if we move to, it allows mitigation if we move to renewable energy. Take a few examples in Africa. Morocco is moving to 50% renewables by 2030, well on target to do it. They were 98% dependent on imported fossil energy. Their electricity system will be 50% renewable. They will be saving hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in energy imports into their country. And they're generating electricity from wind at 4 cents a kilowatt hour and solar at 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour, well below what it costs to generate power from fossil sources, which you have to import. So I'm not saying every country has an analogous situation, but every country has one resource or another. And we need to create a knowledge framework that allows a rapid uptake, the development of a policy framework, a de-risking framework to allow the rapid deployment of renewables in Africa as a way to overcome development and climate challenges in the future. I think this is a golden opportunity for us in the coming years.
I have William Brent here who is asking how important are climate nationally determined contributions in addressing the challenges highlighted? For example, does there need to be more ambitious targets on the link between energy and agriculture added to NDCs? Carlos, Wanjiru, any take-ups? Adnan, please feel free.
Maybe I can just say something, and colleagues may want to also chip in on this one, Kateko. I believe that the national contributions, the NDCs of Africa, are already quite ambitious. In fact, they are amongst the most ambitious when you do a comparative study with the ones that have been submitted. Moreover, Africa is way ahead, together with Europe, in submitting the NDCs. Most of the other regions have not submitted their NDCs, so they are well off target. So we have nothing to really be shamed about what is already there. Now, in terms of how we up our ambition on the links that may exist between some of the targets that we have in the NDCs and the transformative processes that we need to put in place, I think we have some work to do, because some of the countries have just followed a discussion about climate action separated from the discussion on industrialization. And they need to marry the two. And more importantly, our leaders need to understand that industrialization is not just manufacturing. Industrialization is to bring the economy to the industrial era, meaning formalized relations, making sure that you modernize the value chains, taking into account the interaction that must exist between different sectors, including between agriculture and industrial processes, because that's what is going to increase the productivity of agriculture. So it is a more complex attitude than just saying we are going to industrialize. I normally, to make it clear, like to joke by saying, if you think that the Ministry of Industry is going to industrialize, there will be no industrialization, because this is everybody's business or nobody's business. And if you are going to industrialize, it basically means that you have to have it as your priority. And in today's in today's times, we really need to include the leapfrogging dimensions, which are very much related to how we deal with climate and how we deal with technology. So that's really the challenge. And I think some of the NDCs have not yet captured this complexity, but otherwise there's nothing to be ashamed about.
Thank you, Carlos. I think this also gives us a very good segue to get into Crispin Olva's question, who is asking whether they can hear, and if you could share some reflections in terms of other sectors in Africa that have comparative advantage in terms of primary energy production, minerals, and their beneficiation for decarbonized economies. Could you perhaps reflect on that, Carlos, Adnan, Wanjiru, Clarice?
I think that we've addressed many of those questions, because I think that when we look at, Carlos talked about it, Wanjiru, Clarice, when you look at the supply chains of the future and the materials that will be necessary and the processes that will be necessary, I think one of the important things Carlos mentioned is that modernizing the economy just doesn't mean only increasing manufacturing. It means the software for development and the whole range of, industrially related processes that we need, regulation that we need, policy frameworks that we need, institutions that we need, have to start coming into place. And I think, there are, and we've discussed it throughout the discussion, there's a wealth of potential sources of growth in Africa, from minerals, commodities, agriculture and food. On agriculture and food, I looked to Wanjiru and Clarice on this, but my sense is that climate change trends are going to change the pattern of food production and distribution globally. And we need to understand where are the risks and opportunities to Africa in this kind of transformation that we're going to see. There is a sense that there is a potential to increase African agricultural productivity and to safeguard it from climate trends, and to become a producer of food for not only Africa, but for the world. There's always been this vision of Africa as a potential breadbasket for the world. What is the sustainability element of that? Do we necessarily have to go in the direction of huge monocultures and multinationals doing this kind of farming, denuding the land, eroding it, and decreasing biodiversity? Or is there a new way that we can approach that? So I think agriculture, food security is an important issue. Water is going to be critical to Africa. We have huge water stress in many countries. We have increasing unreliability of precipitation and changing precipitation patterns. We need to have a planning process where water, which is going to be at the basis of whatever we do with our economies and urban areas, is available in the quantities and the quality that we need for where we need it, and to support the growth of the African economy. So I think those are the kind of things that we have to think about. And I think what struck me is, and listening to everybody and looking at the questions and comments, is that we need to have a new model of what this climate transition is going to look like for African growth, what it means for the design of our future institutions, what it means for design of policy frameworks, for engagement in trade, what kind of issues will be important in trade. We're going to see, and I'm pretty sure of this, as developed countries advance in mitigation, they will have the case they will make that their cost for mitigation increase the cost of their products, and that carbon component should be met by tariffs on trade. And we need to start understanding what the implication of that is for us. How are we going to organize our supply chains? How are we going to account for carbon? How are we going to participate in carbon markets in the future? And we're not yet equipped to do that. And I think that's one of the important things I would say, that the reason that Salim mentioned there have been 7 meetings of the ACF. I have been happy to sit through all of them because I think that this objective is so important that it needs all of us to participate in it. And I'm honored to do that.
Thank you, Adnan. We only have time for one last question. And the question is directed to Carlos by Olivia Adiambo. What role should civil society organizations play in the implementation of national green growth plans?
They've already been quite active. In fact, this movement of addressing climate injustice started precisely because of the engagement of civil society organizations in Africa that have taken the lead in pushing some of their governments to actually be a bit more forceful in the way they deal with this matter, and also including their voices in the international debate. If you look into how the various discussions about Agenda 2063 have evolved, the voice of civil society was extremely important in capturing a different ambition for the continent and making sure that the list of priorities was adjusted to take into account the new megatrends, including the climate one. So I think this is just good news, and we need more.
Thank you, Carlos. This has been a truly exciting conversation, very interesting insights from our advisory council members. And we have a very well-established framework in terms of what the level of thinking should be for African countries as we move forward with the just transition, and some key considerations around the narratives and policy positions that African heads of state should be taking. I would like to invite Salim Fakir to reflect on the conversation and pivot this in terms of the ACF strategic framework. Salim, please share your insights and capture the conversation for us as it has taken place over the past few hours.
Kateko, I just want to say I cannot do justice to the range and the breadth of the conversation that was going on for over an hour. It is so organic and based on true, authentic reflections from the continent. I just for the audience to get a taste of when we sit in council meetings, the level and the caliber of the discussion that we have to engage with our council members for 3 hours, every meeting we have. And it's a testimony to their depth of experience, breadth of knowledge, and just a wonderful collegial way of engaging these issues with us as a team. In fact, we have a very open council meeting. Many people participate from the team. We prepare, and we are always thrown with wonderful, insightful, surprising conversations. And originality and lateral thinking is really the way to describe that. So I cannot tell you the privilege and the honor to be in this wonderful group of people who are really helping us to wreck our brain on how to make this a truly Pan-African organization, how to create a process of authentic voice and reflection, because I've been in many international organizations. This is the first time I actually want to tell you and speak to the audience that I've never been in a situation where I've been allowed personally to develop and originate ideas without somebody imposing a template from outside of the continent. And I think most people don't actually understand that. The level of autonomy that we have, it has been given by the philanthropies that are funding us, and the humanness of it, the essence of it, because there are many, many organizations on this continent who are effectively just voice and ventriculist of people outside of the continent, told to say things in ways that are aligned to interests that have nothing to do with this continent. And I think this is really the important step for the African Climate Foundation to be able to engage this. And I think being guided by such profound people on the council, the partners that we have, which are not seen and visible, but have been present here, and that this momentum we'll be busy creating behind what I think is a growing and evolving idea that holds an authentic voice and space that is organic. One has to treasure that and one has to protect that, because it's a very rare currency and commodity on the African continent at the moment. I have to be honest with you. I think Carlos, Adnan, Clarice, and Wanjiro, we've all worked for international organizations. And it's very difficult for me to say this to people who don't live on the continent, what this means to us. So thanks.
Thank you, Salim, for that. And I'd just like to share some key reflections on the dialogue and the conversation itself. I think it has been very fruitful. A lot of learning has taken place in this virtual room, but some key highlights that I'm seeing for our trajectory as we walk this path or embark on this clean energy trajectory as the continent is that we need to start shaping and co-creating solutions as a continent that is shared and underpinned by a shared agenda to tackle the climate crisis. And this should encompass support for advocacy initiatives that position us as a continent as we move forward with this, especially in terms of a green economic recovery agenda, as well as a just and people-centered transition. We need to also identify spaces for policy influence where we could identify champions and catalytic agents who can start pushing a Pan-African narrative on how we approach a just transition as the continent. Thirdly is that we need to amplify civic voices in terms of how we bridge the divide between the development and climate nexus. And lastly, the important part that came out from the conversation is that there is a fundamental need for consensus building in our approach to policy formulation on the continent. And I think that is a change starter. Adnan has mentioned this a few times in his reflections that we need to be strategic in how we position ourselves as a continent, but also in how we frame and tackle issues of economic transformation, economic development, and sustainable livelihoods. I'd like to thank all of you, especially our advisory council members, for joining us for this very important conversation. I'd like to thank our partners on behalf of the African Climate Foundation who have joined us from across the world for this important discussion today. A warm thanks as well to our participants who have been with us throughout this conversation. And thank you for joining us. And I'd like to add that our full strategic framework is available on our website and social media pages.
Kateko, I wanted to interrupt you because I really want to thank you for the wonderful way you've managed this conversation in a freestyle, organically. And just to tell the audience that you've only been 1 month with ACF, so a really brilliant job done. So I just wanted to thank you. Thank you very much. And also Kelly, who's also just joined us, and the crew that has been working behind the scene to make this happen. And really the audience who have come and spent 2 hours with us. That's really privileged to have them listen to, not myself, but all of these wonderful people. Thank you.